broadcasting from the Unshackled studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by the Unshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Unshackled's coverage via WilmsFront of the Northern Territory election night count on this Saturday the 22nd of August 2020. It is 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, which is half an hour behind Northern Territory time, which means their polls closed an hour and a half ago. We are live both on the Unshackled and WilmsFront channels. So we are multi-streaming to both YouTube channels tonight, since this is a significant evening and a panel stream. Unfortunately, no D-Live tonight. So for tonight, we'll not just be analysing the Northern Territory election results as they roll in, but we'll also discuss the broader Australian political implications from the nation's first post-coronavirus pandemic election in Australia, with the internal border closures now becoming the most highly politicised issue that we currently face. Now, I'd like to introduce my panel for this stream, who've all previously been on either WilmsFront or Unshackled episodes in the past. First up, Professor David Flint. He's had an extensive academic career as a legal expert. He's been a media regular, commentator and a political activist. He is the National Convenor of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy. David, welcome back.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening.
We've got Alexandra Marshall. She's a popular conservative social media commentator with over 16,000 followers now on Twitter under her handle Ellie Melly. She has written articles for the Spectator Australia and Penthouse magazine, as well as previous appearances on WilmsFront. She's appeared on Sky News Australia and Pello Talk Live. Alexandra, good to do another stream with you.
Thank you for having me. Lovely to be here again.
And we've got returning Jacob Watts. He was previously the Unshackled's editor-at-large from 2017 to 2018. Recently, he's been a research fellow with the Australian Taxpayers Alliance and has been published in Quadrant magazine and the Spectator Australia. Jacob, welcome to WilmsFront.
Evening, Tim. Good to be with you.
So we've come to know the Northern Territory Chief Minister, Michael Gunner, quite well over the course of this year through the National Cabinet, which was convened by Scott Morrison at the beginning of this pandemic, replacing COAG. And obviously he has campaigned on the fact that he kept community transmission to extremely almost insignificant levels in the Northern Territory, even though he had been in a lot of political trouble at the beginning of the year through the Territory's finances heading further south through a bloated public service. Though the main opposition there, or traditional opposition, I should say, the Country Liberal Party, which is a combination of the Liberal and National parties, Leah Finocchiaro is the leader. I probably mispronounced that. I'm probably the king of mispronunciations. And there's also the Territory Alliance, whose leader is former CLP Chief Minister Terry Mills. Now, Michael Gunner, he's reasonably young. He's 44. He's going for a second term. Leah Finocchiaro is only 35. Terry Mills, well, being a political veteran, is 62. Based on the current counting of the votes, the Labor Party is projected to so far have won 11 seats, the Country Liberal Party 6, and the Territory Alliance 1. Labor were the favourite to just get back over the line. But I first want to basically put it open to the panel. Is this, if Labor does win, is this going to be just an election based on territory issues, or does it have other implications to how the other state leaders go whether they are encouraged to continue their border closures for as long as possible. Who would like to go first?
So,
Yep, you spoke first.
I'll go. So what you're saying is the Northern Territory election a litmus test for the other Australian elections that are coming up, most particularly Queensland?
Yes.
Is that your main question?
Because Anastasia Palaszczuk today, because there were 9 new cases, she has limited indoor and outdoor gatherings to 10 people, which is pretty extreme for just 9 new cases. And she is hardening that that hard border with the New South Wales, which of course Coolangatta, Tweed Heads being the twin cities, causing significant local angst in those communities.
I go forward and say yes and no, in that it's not going to be so much a reckoning for the Labor Party one way or another. It's going to be for any party in charge, because they are all following a similar lockdown plan for the states. Even New South Wales, the Liberal Party, who has the state most open, is still engaging in COVID restrictions that are on par with the National Cabinet's decisions around the country. So this election is being held too early to give a good indication of what the fallout from COVID is going to be, because the money is still rolling in from the government to people to wait out the lockdowns, and the banks have not called in the mortgages and the rents yet. So when that happens and people start to lose their houses and their jobs aren't coming back because businesses have closed, that is when we will see the political reckoning. It'll be pretty much everyone will switch shells. So if you're a Liberal, they'll switch to Labor. If they're Labor, they'll switch to Liberal. So I think this election will be more you'll see a bit more Liberal come up from the failings of Labor's previous politics and the state how it's being run. And then you'll have the COVID crisis. We don't want to change our leader during an emergency vote, which will probably keep Gunner in power. So I think it's too early for a litmus test if we're going to use the Northern Territory. Queensland will be a good example.
Now, I should also point out that, Alexandria, you're in New South Wales, so you're in probably the state which has achieved so far suppression, not pursued elimination.
I'm a pretty good test case for a nightmare, because my businesses are in Melbourne, and for our other businesses, we have to get stock from Queensland. So not only can we not get stock across the border for our own New South Wales business, but our other businesses are in Melbourne, completely shut down, and bills are coming in, and the government has no plans to reopen for weeks and weeks and weeks. So it's funny, we talk about New South Wales and the states as being separate, but many people have their businesses spread across because we're a federation, and it's difficult to maintain any semblance of normal life, even in an open state like New South Wales.
David, you're in Sydney, so you're in the same jurisdiction as Alexandria, though Sydney is considered a bit more of a coronavirus hotspot. But I'll first get your opinion first on, is this a border election, as I've put it?
Well, I think it won't make much difference to the national picture. The National Cabinet, I think, is bereft of leadership. We have a group of people there who make decisions without proper evidence. And I think they showed that at the very beginning of the lockdown. Well, firstly, they showed that in the standards they adopted in relation to entry. They were very lax. And when it came to the lockdown, they failed spectacularly to look at world's best practice. And I'm no expert in this field, but it was obvious to me when they did that world's best practice was demonstrated by Taiwan. Taiwan had all the experience, they'd done a lot of it, and they didn't have the advantage which we have of being a remote island nation. If you're a remote island nation, you can control entry much more than anybody else can, much more than, for example, Sweden can. If you look at Fiji, for example, I don't think there may have been one or no deaths. And when you compare the results between ourselves and Taiwan, ours with the significant advantage of being remote, Taiwan with being next to China, but imposing high standard entry requirements a very good quarantine, including the self-quarantine, which was supervised electronically in relation to protecting the vulnerable. They've done it without a lockdown, without imposing enormous costs on the economy, without causing all the distress and upset of ruining so many small businesses and throwing people out of work. So I don't think our national cabinet is very good. I doubt if whoever comes to head the territory will improve that. One of the dangers of this sort of thing, and we've got Lord Acton's great warning that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. As the premiers and the Prime Minister have acquired more power, more and more, they've begun to abuse that. They're abusing it over the borders. They're abusing it, for example, over travel. The determination that the Minister made in relation to overseas travel resembles more East Germany than a democratic, free country. And he's gone beyond the powers that he has under the legislation in his determination. All he could do under the legislation is to prevent or control the virus going to other countries. But he's decided that there's a blanket prescription on travel unless you can get an exemption on very tight areas, which they're not likely to give from some faceless bureaucrat. So I don't think this is going to affect or improve in any way the way in which they're running it. They've all run it very badly. Everyone, every Premier, every Chief Minister and the Prime Minister have failed, I think, spectacularly. When it comes to the Northern Territory, they're not a state. So the prescription in the Constitution about freedom, commerce and intercourse being absolutely free, it's among the states. That's what the section says. We had the benefit of a Privy Council in the 30s in telling us that this also applied to the Commonwealth, that federal law was also constrained by this. When you come to the Northern Territory, it is really a subordinate entity under the Commonwealth. And Mr. Morrison could very easily control them if they behave stupidly, as they're talking about, I think, keeping the border prescriptions until sometime next year, which is absolutely ridiculous. And Morrison should show some leadership over that. And if the Northern Territory government decides to lock down its borders for no good reason other than showing how powerful the Chief Minister is, the Prime Minister should show some leadership and stop that, because we really need to get back on track as a country.
May I ask?
Yes.
May I ask you a question? I know that it's not my show. May I do it, Tim?
Yes, go ahead, though. Jacob, after that, gets
Yeah,
to
no,
make
I
his
know.
opening remarks.
It's just it's well on topic.
Okay.
My followers have been asking over and over again about this constitutional arrangement with sovereignty and borders, and it seems to them that once the premiers and the Prime Minister have decided to abuse power, as you're explaining, there are no mechanisms sitting on top of them that are working to rein them back in or even question them about the limitations of the power and if they were overstepping it. Do you think that there are sufficient limitations and they're just not being used, or is that a concern for the future?
I don't think there are sufficient limitations. Really, in the making of subordinate legislation, that is, the ministers making laws under an act, I think it should at least go to the Executive Council. It should come before the Governor and the ministers. And in the past, we've had some very well-advised governors like Sir Guy Green in Tasmania, who've been prepared to ask whether he had the power to do this, whether there were any conditions on his power. I think it would, with a good governor, a governor, not necessarily a lawyer governor, but a governor who has the sense to get legal advice on what he's doing. And we had some very good examples in New South Wales and federally, where governors and governors generals in this auditing area, where the ministers come before the Viceroy and they recommend his or her doing something, that shouldn't be just automatic. There should be a way, and it's worked well in those states which have had a good governor. But where the legislation delegates this to the minister, I think that is dangerous, because the minister is not subject then to any real control. And we see this in relation to the travel bans. I think the travel bans are illegal. I think it's completely unlawful for Greg Hunt to have done what he's done. And anybody who's really upset about this should go to the federal court and challenge it. The courts are a clumsy way of correcting this sometimes, particularly the High Court. If you've got to go to the High Court, it'll take too long to get on. That said, when it came to the 2010 election, when people objected to the law that said the rolls close on the day the election's called, that was put in by Howard because there's an enormous amount of fraud. People put in fraudulent registrations between the closing of the rolls and the calling of the election. They went to the High Court, and the High Court invented a rule in the Constitution that Parliament can't do that. So that election and the 2013 election contain an enormous amount of fraud. People think that fraud in elections in Australia is by people going around voting more than once. That is a problem. There were about, according to the Electoral Commission, there were about 20,000 or more cases last year. They didn't prosecute anybody. And they bent over backwards, I think, to keep it as small as possible. But the big problem is fraudulent registrations. Now, I think that the High Court there bent over backwards because the election was coming on. They heard the case very quickly within the short period between the calling of the election and the actual election itself. And they let in 100,000 extra people, which Get Up boasted that they did, and they affected the 2010 election. Now, I think the High Court should move quickly on this, but they're not showing any sign of doing that. So that's a problem. I think we need more control over the politicians, and there should be more control through direct democracy. We should, A, be able to recall governments, as they can in some American states and one Canadian province. I think citizen-initiated referenda are also a way to control. I think we need much more control over our politicians because they're showing dictatorial tendencies during this crisis.
Well, I might segue then to Jacob, who's a Melburnian like myself, and we tomorrow will mark the halfway mark of the stage 4 restrictions, where we have both the state of disaster and state of emergency enacted by Premier Dan Andrews. So we have the legislation which the state of emergency is enacted is the Public Health and Wellbeing Act of 2008, which, fun fact, Dan Andrews was the health minister who introduced that, and then the Emergency Management Act of 2013 is where the state of disaster declaration comes from, which in case you haven't been told, the state of disaster powers grants the authorities enormous powers to enter premises without warrants. It's extremely, it gives the state extreme powers, and also to suspend some of the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. But you spoke there, David, about direct democracy, and I know in your book, Give Us Back Our Country, recall elections. I know that there's plenty of Victorians at the moment who would love a recall election now, given that Dan Andrews doesn't face the polls, if he's still there, by November 2022. So, Jacob, your perspective.
I can't say I have the wisdom of Professor David Flint, but I will offer a layperson's perspective here. I really think there's tremendous trouble. I was listening to Alan Collier in his podcast Money Cafe in the Australian. He was saying that 55% of mortgage holders are receiving JobKeeper and job seeker subsidies. We're going to walk off an economic cliff like you've never seen before. We had a 35-40% downturn in the ASX. It's completely bounced back. We're in this huge bubble, and the chief ministers and the premiers are just giving the naughty kids candy bars. Everyone's getting diabetes and everyone's teeth are falling out, and it's going to be a complete and utter disaster. And everyone's hiding under the doona, stuffing their face full of McNuggets of JobKeeper payments, and they're ignoring the reality. The reality is that if the states don't open up, perhaps with the exception of Victoria, I'm a Victorian, I'll say lock Victoria out. But if the states don't open up, we could have Qantas go down. What are we going to have as a country? We're going to be a vassal state for superpowers, and these well, a lot of them unelected bureaucrats making decisions for us, completely unconstitutional. I believe Section 92 of the Constitution dictates there should be no prohibitions on the movement of or of trade, of free trade. In effect, these borders and all the permits and everything you have to go, it's in effect a way of a tariff. It's in effect a way of blocking trade. And we're turning into 6 little micro despot dictator states. We need to unify as a nation, and there needs to be some accountability here. And I think that we won't see too much from this election because we haven't fallen off the cliff yet. But once we fall off the cliff, we'll really see what's going on.
Tim, could I add something?
Yeah, go for it.
And I agree with Jake entirely. I want to add something to my answer to Alexandra. She asked what controls are there. There's another control which we should have, which we're not having, and that is of a free and responsible media. I'm not talking about, Tim, your media, because I think you're making a marvelous contribution, but the mainstream media have failed very much in fulfilling their role. And I think part of the reason is that Morrison realized after the bushfires, when he went off on a holiday to Honolulu, that he could be very harshly treated by the media. And what he did, as I understand it, is he duchessed the media. To duchess is an old word, which all of you are far too young to know, but it used to refer to the practice of the British. When an Australian politician went to London, he was duchessed by the British. They treated him very well. They might even give him a knighthood. That changed one New South Wales premier in the 19th century from being a Republican into a non-Republican. He didn't really become a monarchist, but he certainly grabbed the title. Now, what Morrison did was he duchessed the leading people in the media, and they were invited into the cabinet room, and they were briefed on the lockdown. This is what I've read. And I understand that they were so impressed by this, the media fell into line, and they began to not analyze and examine and question. They just rearranged the press releases. Then, of course, particularly for the television media, they went into panic mode because panic or shock promotes ratings, it sells newspapers. And so we get every evening on the news, we get the details of the number of people who tested positive, who happen to go into some little Thai restaurant. And this becomes the news, and they're checking on what contacts they have. All of this is, of course, nonsense. We don't do it in relation to other pandemics, which we have every couple of years, influenza and so on. We don't do that. It's not the way that you control the pandemic. But what I'm saying is there's also a significant absence of the mainstream media in doing their job. The Australians starting to, I notice on Sky, they're also doing it, but not the mainstream media, and particularly not the television, which is the principal source of information, it seems, these days, and what they can do on devices and so on.
Can I just add to that? Because I've given that Victoria, mainly we are the home of Australia's second wave, and every morning, it's now 50 days in a row, Dan Andrews has had his daily press conferences, which were all on edge to see how he's going to view the numbers, whether he's going to set us free anytime soon, or we'll have a bit more freedom. The Melbourne press pack for so long, they were cheering him on to introduce stage 3 masks, then stage 4, and basically giving him the permission to keep going further. And the mainstream media and the daily newspapers did nothing to install a sense of calm in the Victorian community. This is what fueled all the renewed rounds of panic buying, because the media were continually. And it's really terrible what they did. It's like, oh, this is what stage 4 could look like, and they quote some epidemiologist at a university to say, oh, this is what it might look like, and the ordinary person sees that and it's like, these are incredible proposed restrictions, which is completely irresponsible. Jacob, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do. There has been some valuable contribution in the Australian by Adam Crichton, by some others. There was one interesting article that I read a couple of days ago, was saying that if 1,000 people a day were being infected in Victoria, then it would take 18 years for the whole state to be infected. We also know that there's around a 99% or 98% that are mild cases, 2% that are severe. So I think there's a problem that probably goes down to our education, maybe some cultural weakness, where we don't really have the grasp of numbers. We don't have that strong unified spirit anymore. We're more easily taken away. And you saw Dan Andrews begging for drones. I don't know where these drones were used. Were they used in Helmand province? I don't know where they were used, probably in Afghanistan or flying over Yemen.
They were.
like
That's what
this.
the ADF spokesman said at Senate estimates. So they were the ones used in Afghanistan.
Well, that we're talking about Kandahar and Helmand. We're not talking about, Craigieburn and Height. People shouldn't be treated as suspected terrorists for walking their dogs in the park. And I don't know. I think some of our institutions have been whittled down a bit. If Whitlam could be taken out by Sir John Kerr, why can't Dan Andrews? Well, because they've got some lefty do-nothing Governor-General. We need some power to actually get rid of people like Dan Andrews, because he's totally corrupt, totally inept, and he's totally got no control. And he passed these laws. He passed these horrific laws to kill and crush business, these industrial manslaughter laws. Now, so if a top company, if they're responsible for a death from their work, then the whole board of the company can go to jail. Now, I say there should be a motion moved when Dictator Dan allows Victorian Parliament to be reopened for his culpability of those deaths through his mismanagement of the hotel quarantine saga. Now, if he wants to throw the boards of top companies in jail, then he should live under the same law and practice what he preaches and feel the weight of those very laws that he's passed through Parliament, because his actions have turned the clock back on the Victorian economy by 5+ years. Now, I know a handy stat in the US, for every 1% unemployment goes up, there's 30,000 deaths. Now, people try and say there's a separate thing between economics and health. Economics and health are one of the same. If there's unemployment, there are terrible health consequences. And as far as I'm concerned, Daniel Andrews has got blood on his hands.
There isn't a lockdown death tally, which there should be. We get the coronavirus death tally, every day here in Victoria, though we had our Chief Health Officer, Dr. Brett Sutton, confess this week that if a person dies in palliative care, and obviously they already had underlying health conditions, but if they've got coronavirus when they die, they're counted as a death.
Well, can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
First of all, I just give you an update on the Northern Territory election, just in case you guys are wondering. Labor has 11 seats. The Country Liberal Party have 6, and the Territory Alliance have 2 as of 4 minutes ago.
7 to 9.
Yeah, 21.7% of the vote has been counted, so still a long way to go. And 50% of Territorians voted early. And an interesting fact, to have the elections COVID safe, they didn't have the traditional how to vote card, people offering them. We've all voted countless times, so we know that it's called running the gauntlet, where you get all of the how to vote cards. They were just on a stand outside the polling booth, and you just took the one that you want.
Voting cards are dead anyway. When I was doing the elections for the state, no one wants voting cards. They've got it on their phone. So that's anyway. I was going to say about Australian politics and Victoria in particular. We seem to have turned fear into a virtue. It's as if the entire country has been turned into a giant safe space. And people get very angry, including Conservatives, when they find people who don't want to live in fear. They seem to take that as a personal attack on them if you are not afraid. And I've seen lifelong Conservatives tearing other Conservatives apart over the COVID-19 issue. But I pointed out online that if people were not being paid to stay at home, you would find that all these anti-democracy people would suddenly be on the streets if it was their finances and their homes on the line. So in many ways, the economic job keeper and job seeker and the grants going out are warping people's perspective of democracy. It's like we're being paid to give up power to the premiers and our prime minister. And they don't like it when you point that out, but it seems to hold true. The people who are complaining are those who are copying the worst of the economic devastation, and that is the small business community, particularly Victoria, who can't trade. And I have, what they've said to, Daniel Andrews has said to small businesses is, your rents are due. We've set up a committee to arbitrate the process, but you have to work it out with your landlord. How can they possibly work out there being no income? That's not something that you can arbitrate. You can't solve the problem that the government has created. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of logic going on inside Daniel Andrews' office or his supposed genius ministers if they can't work a basic economic principle like that out.
Well, this is where when Stage 4 was implemented, and there was heaps of confusion about what industries would have to be scaled back or were not permitted workers under the permitted worker scheme. This is when the Melbourne Press Gallery finally flipped and started asking the hard questions, and when a lot of ordinary Victorians are flipped, because a lot more of them were impacted by Stage 4 than Stage 3, and it was such a breakthrough for me personally, that finally people are beginning to see just how, with it just going that little bit further, how crippling these lockdown restrictions are. And as I know all of you have said, the economic reckoning still hasn't happened yet.
Well, next time you're in Sydney, if you walk down George Street, you'll see that the business owners are using JobKeeper to pay for their rents and their overheads. And then there's a line of kids outside the Gucci store who would never normally be lined up outside the Gucci store, sitting there. There was maybe 50 people in a line there. No other stores open. Everybody else is closed, but there was a line of kids outside Gucci buying $1,000 items. It was extraordinary.
That is
Tim,
bizarre.
could I come back to something that Jake said?
Yep.
He referred to the governor. There were there was one control you had in Victoria, and it was often than in any other state. And that was the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council in Victoria could always reject supply. And that sometimes brought governments to an election quite quickly, because it needs, of course, the supply bill to be on the agenda. But that happens twice a year. And in 2002, the principal parties colluded together to get rid of that. They'd seen what had happened in Canberra, and neither of them wanted it to happen to either of them, no doubt. So in Victoria, they lost the right to reject supply, as has every other Australian state except Queensland, which doesn't have an upper house. As to the governor sacking someone for behaving illegally, that last happened in Australia when Sir Philip Gomes sacked Jack Lang. Jack Lang was refusing to pay interest due to overseas bondholders, or to local and overseas bondholders. He was holding it back. In fact, there was an extraordinary scene where Jack Lang, as the Premier, went in his chauffeured car to the banks in Martin Place, and he withdrew all of the money from the state banks and took the money back to the chauffeured car and took them round to the Trades Hall building and stored all the money of the state was stored at the Trades Hall building. Quite extraordinary. The governor warned him that he was behaving illegally several times.
No kidding.
Eventually, the governor dismissed him and called the Leader of the Opposition and ensured that the Leader of the Opposition recommended an election. An election was held, and Jack Lang lost the election magnificently. And so we got a new governor in New South Wales. Now, no governor, I don't think today, governors would be loath to do that unless they were very sure of the illegality of what is happening. And in Victoria, I think the governor would say, well, I'd like that to be tested in the courts rather than my doing it. I'm sure she wouldn't.
So there's no fail point. If the Governor General fails to act or a governor fails to act, there seems to be no prompting or like nobody stops and says, hey, you should be calling or at least looking at the behavior of a leader. There seems to be nobody to monitor or judge the Governor General or the governors of the state.
In 1975, when the press fell out with Whitlam, the Australian, for example, was a strong supporter. Murdoch was a strong supporter of Whitlam getting into government, but then they saw what the mess he made of the country, the financial mess in particular. And the newspapers, most of the newspapers were demanding that the Governor General act. There was a general view in the country, the Governor General should do something. And eventually, as we know, Sir John Kerr did, for which he was reviled. And he got no support from Fraser when he got in. Fraser abandoned him having got in, and Fraser subsequently campaigned for a republic. He completely abandoned.
Even though it worked.
Yes, so Fraser double-crossed him. But the other thing I'd like to mention is Victoria is, I think, a special case. And I noticed this when we were running the referendum campaign in 1999. We realized from polling, and I never trust polling fully, but polling quite often is not just to work out what the opinion is, it's quite often to frame opinion, and particularly at that stage when all of the media were campaigning for a republic, and the pollsters were too. But we realized that Victoria was our weakest state, which surprised me because I used to think Victoria was a very conservative state, but I was told I was wrong. It wasn't. It's a Whig state, not a Tory state. But what we appointed as our director down there, a DLP man very close to the DLP, and he recommended that instead of campaigning on federal electorates, we should organise our campaign on the smaller state electorates, and we should play a very soft role in Victoria and go along with the assumption, not contest too much the assumption that Victoria was going to vote yes. And what happened was that it was the only state where the result was close. It was very close. The no case still won in Victoria, but Victoria Well, the other thing we found was we couldn't find a leading politician. None of the leaders, even the country party, would support the no case in Victoria, whereas in other states we could get a prominent leader who would support the no case. So Victoria is, I think, the most liberal in the American sense, the most small L liberal of any part of Australia.
Oh, you're absolutely right, David, about the Victoria being more of a Whig, small L liberal state than Conservative, because even though the Liberal Party was in power for 27 years from 1955 to 82, the premiers during those time, Henry Bolte and also Dick Hammer, were moderates. The final premier during that time, Lindsay Thompson, was the only Conservative, and Kennett, even though he was because of his radical reforms, radical in a good sense, he was called a fascist, but he was actually a small L liberal. When the Victorian Liberal Party were last in power from 2010 to 2014, Ted Bellew and Dennis Napthines were both small L liberals as well, and obviously the Labor Party over time, and in Victoria, as they've won more, has become more hard left.
Yeah, if I could interject there, Tim, I really think that if you don't have any brand difference between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, people are just going to go for the Labor Party, aren't they? So I think a key mistake that's made, although I'm not talking about any internal affairs of the Liberal Party, but I would say that a key mistake is not having brand differentiation, not realising that you need to be the voice of working people, of small business people, and that you need to just display a general degree of common sense and get your heads out of the clouds, the intellectual clouds of political correctness and woke left ideology, and you just need to get on with practically governing a state. I think if the Liberal Party represents liberal values in Victoria and they put effort into those new multicultural areas in the west of Melbourne, there's many people there. You'll see them, huge amounts of people, double-storey, four-bedroom homes, BMWs. Why should they be Labor voters? A lot of them have small businesses. It's because no one's made the effort to go and talk to them, to knock on their door, to have a chat with them. I don't think that Victoria is intrinsically left-wing. I don't think so at all. But I've just got a question for Professor Flint here. So when would a police force cease acting as a police force and then start acting as a military? Because if you're guarding borders and you're, prohibiting or violating the Constitution, there's Constitution provisions stating that the states can't have their own armies. But if the police are acting in a way that's blocking off borders, is that in effect acting as an army, and is that unconstitutional as well as the fact that it's also restricting the movement? I don't know exactly what constitutional provision that is, but I just wanted a point of clarification there.
Well, that's precisely true. The states can't have armed forces. The Constitution provides that that's a matter exclusively for the Commonwealth. But getting back to Section 92, that's the trade, commerce and intercourse among the states shall be absolutely free.
Can you just describe for our audience the legal definition of intercourse?
Intercourse are relationships outside of trade and commerce. It's a separate concept, and it would involve, for example, people going across the border for things other than business, not being involved in trade. For example, I'm just trying to think of examples. For example,
Well, say a person going from Tweed Heads to Cool
Cool.
and Grad for a surf.
Yes, to go exactly, or a clergyman going across to give a sermon, or somebody going across to see a sick relative. These are matters which are outside of trade and commerce, but certainly intercourse. And it was always accepted by the High Court and the Privy Council that there was always the possibility of there being restrictions and controls on the borders. The question was, what was the purpose? So, for example, you can't bring in fruit from New South Wales into another state where there is a fear that that may contaminate the fruit of the other state. The purpose there is legitimate. It's part of the Americans call police power. So, for example, you could, in special circumstances where there was a legitimate and proportionate need to protect New South Wales from some serious health problem across the border, to close that part of the border, that would be legitimate. But I would say that what is being done doesn't pass the test of what is a purpose, and whether acting on that purpose legitimately and proportionately. I think it is ridiculous what they're doing, particularly for those communities which cross the borders, the agricultural communities where they go across the borders backwards and forwards without even considering that there's a state line there, as you have between Queensland and New South Wales on the coast. I don't think that's appropriate, and I think it demonstrates to me the great need for new states in Australia. And what we've seen with I think the excessive amount of immigration, considering that we've abandoned our manufacturing industry, what we're seeing is the concentration of populations, particularly in the three eastern capitals, so that they are over-dominating their states. Sydney is far too big and too dominant, so that most of the politicians seem to be, or vast number of the politicians seem to come from Sydney. So little concern, little attention is paid to what is happening in the rest of the state. The same in Victoria, the same in Queensland. Everything in Queensland is decided principally from the southeast corner, and North Queensland, which many people there want to be a separate state. I think there's a very good reason for that. We need to decentralize more in Australia, and I think this crisis, this so-called crisis, I don't think it's really a crisis, but this problem of the COVID-19, which I prefer to call the Wuhan virus, this virus is, I think it's demonstrated that the premiers are far too powerful, and the politicians in each capital are far too powerful, and there are too many of them in the capital, not enough representation from the regional areas.
I've got some election update here. The Territory Alliance leader, Terry Mills, has lost his seat of Blaine, predicted by Anthony Green. But it's unclear if the Country Liberal Party or Labor will win that seat. So I thought that was an interesting update on the former Country Liberal Party leader. Mills has lost his seat. Labor's currently tracking to win 10 seats, Country Liberal 5, and others 3. And there was also an independent. Now, one of you fine minds here on the panel will have to jig my memory. He's an Aboriginal fellow. Been reading about him in the Australian. He won his seat by, I believe, 7 votes at the last election.
Sorry.
I'm
Well,
looking it up here.
You found it?
Yeah, is that the seat of Mulcair?
Yeah.
I'll probably mispronounce this. I mispronounce. Yingia Mark Goyala. He's easily going to win. He's at a 5.7% swing there.
So there's been a lot of talk in the print media, especially with the Australian, of Aboriginals running as independents because they believe that the ALP or has been the Labor Party has been screwing them over, has been crony and corrupt, and so I think there's a few high-profile independents to look at there, which is actually an interesting development in the territory, that there's such high-profile independents running. I've got another kind of point here, I guess, that I'd like everyone's input on. I've been reading The Menzies Era by John Howard. I'm about 430 pages in of a 690-page book. But Howard was pointing out that he believed that the ACT should just be governed as a local city council like Washington, D.C. is in the States. Do you think that we should, Professor Flint saying more states, do you think that maybe having the Northern Territory governed as a set of local city councils, or having it made into a state, is there any possibilities for federation reform? Would anyone think in regards to that?
Well, I imagine it'll be a province of China before long. So the question may not be up to us.
Yeah, I just want to segue there for a moment. You mentioned China province, and there was a reply to your tweet talking about tonight, which seats are the CCP going to win, and I commented that the Port of Darwin is a very safe seat to them because that has been leased to the Chinese for 99 years, and this is another thing about, well, it's one thing for a state to do it, but it's a territory, and the federal government, they're not happy about it, but are not acting where they can to override a territory decision.
Worse than that, Tim. That's an example of Canberra not even paying attention to what's going on around Australia in its states or its territory, because they had the opportunity to review and to stop that from happening, and they did nothing to stop it. So, sorry,
that's
David.
True. That's true. They stopped euthanasia in the territory, and they stopped same-sex marriage in the ACT. But on that question of the ACT, Jake, I think you're right. I don't think the ACT should be self-governed. I like John Stone's suggestion a few years ago, and that was that the Capital Territory be the triangle between Parliament and I think the up to Government House, and it'd be a small triangle. That'd be the ACT, and the rest would just go into New South Wales. So you'd have a little Capital Territory administered by the government with a local council. And I think the idea of the ACT being quasi-self-governing is ridiculous for your capital.
But with your states, David, you're wanting more states. I understand where you come from, being a country person. I mean, we've got no dams, and we'll never have dams because there's no votes in building infrastructure for the country. There just isn't. And it's controlled largely by city politicians who, when you speak to politicians, they're too frightened to pass proper advances in country areas in case they offend the city electorates. You know, they're worried that if they build a whole new reservoir, then that'll upset their 4 inner city suburbs. They'll lose those votes. So I get where you're coming from as far as redrawing boundaries, but if you look at how they redrew boundaries, they're making them more and more Labor rather than Liberal by how they draw boundaries. So you might end up with a situation where you have more chance of having more Labor boundaries instead of large Liberal states, which we can turn at an election.
And it also goes down to planning policy as well. The Labor Party's planning policy in Victoria is about sprawl. So they're wanting to take over country areas by putting small block Simmons homes going all through the countryside, cutting up rural electorates and stealing their voice. But
They
a
also
good
steal our
planning,
property too.
yes, but a good planning policy would say, if you want good infrastructure in the suburbs, then maybe build some towers, cluster your development up if you want a case for a railway station or some more development. But this whole idea that we can keep spreading Melbourne and Sydney wider and wider into the advances of never, never is really destroying Australia. So we definitely do. We do need a new approach. We do need a new way of looking at things. But you have to remember that politicians work on self-interest, and especially the Labor Party politicians and the Labor-aligned bureaucrats, their self-interest is it's separate. It's divorced from the interest of Australia or the interest of Victoria or the interest of New South Wales, and we're under the tyranny of being ruled by unelected bureaucrats.
And that's where the danger comes in when you've got a press class that's compliant, because politicians are terrified of the press, and the press drive political policy because the politicians respond to what they think is popular, which is an endless cycle of carnage.
Can I just jump in there with the urban-rural issue there? Because obviously Australia is a highly urbanized nation, is becoming more urbanized now. The state of Queensland, more and more population and therefore electorates in the southeast, and the same is happening with Melbourne. And I just want to jump in and talk about the AEC redistributions for the next election, which is that Victoria will gain another seat. They got another seat going into the last federal election. They went from 37 to 38, so they'll go to 39 by the time of whether it'll be 2021, 2022. And the seat that was created at the last federal election, Fraser, was smack bang in the middle of inner West Melbourne, so it was already a safe Labor seat. But this redistribution, Victoria will get another seat, but the Northern Territory will lose a seat, and they only have 2 seats, which is Solomon, which takes in Darwin, and Lingiari, which takes in the rest of the state. So to be a single electorate for the whole state, whole territory, I should say, so that the member for the Northern Territory has to represent all the people of that vast area, and also Western Australia will lose a seat as well. That'll bring the parliament back to 150. There's actually talk of passing legislation through the parliament to guarantee the Northern Territory 2 federal seats, sort of like how the Australian Constitution guarantees Tasmania 5, even though based on population it should have less.
Yeah, and why don't we have the same protections that we have for the Senate, maybe into the House as well? I don't know how you could exactly do that, but what is there? There's 12 senators from each state. So I think there needs to be some look into this, because there's a slow salami slicing of the democratic process that's being done by unelected Labor-aligned bureaucrats, because Australia is not a particularly left-wing country. I'd say it's quite an aspirational, right-wing, capitalistic, family-focused country, but there's megaphones that are given to the inner city and to some of these suburbs. But middle Australia is just given radio silence. So there needs to be a real focus on the salami slicing of democracy, slicing out blue ribbon suburbs and putting them into deep red areas, because this is gerrymandering 101, and it's taking the voice away from the people. And there needs to be more oversight from this. But the problem is there's a whole corrupt media class that are in on the show, and there's absolutely no oversight in it. And how many people do you hear at your local cafe talking about the inner machinations of the AEC or the VEC or whatever electoral commission it is? No one really gives a continental about this kind of stuff. But it really does rob the voices from the people.
But Jacob, that's because the ordinary person does not focus their lives around politics. And so they don't understand. It takes people like yourself who are extremely knowledgeable to translate into small little chunks of information and push it out all the time to educate the people on what is actually being done to the political process, because they obviously have lives to live and they're not going to revolve them around the political process. But we can educate them, and Labor spends a lot of time teaching kids and putting out propaganda in order to teach their side of the story and what they're up to. But Conservatives don't really have spines in the industry as far as that is concerned, or any effort to do the same.
Look at what they do with these multicultural councils, and they have these little factional sub-chiefs, and they give them grants, and they set up these fake corporations, and they give all these huge grants to certain ethnic communities to buy them off.
I agree with you, but why is Scott Morrison still feeding them in? Like, why do the Liberals still feed into the Labor councils? Like, why do they do that? Why do they set up their own councils?
Well, what needs to be done is the right more broadly. Now, I'm not going to be partisan, but the right more broadly, that's family-minded, small business-minded people, traditional people, they need to take things like council elections seriously. They need to take things like public service seriously again, because we love demonising public service. And yes, there are lots of terrible things, especially with the Australian Bolshevik Collective, the ABC. I mean, there's many unrepresentative, terrible public institutions, but we need to take these seriously again as Conservatives. We need to get in there and start managing things again, because we can't offshore the management of Australia.
No,
I think is that. Sorry.
I was only going to say it's the role of our politicians, the Conservative politicians, who have the power to change that discussion and to set up boards of their own and to change the education systems. They're in power, and they don't use that power to affect that kind of change you're talking about. It's not going to come from Conservative voters, because by definition, they're too busy running businesses. They're not activists. Conservatives don't engage in activism unless it's the end of the world. So
I summarize it as basically living life, which we can't live life at the moment.
Sorry, David. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Not at all. But one of the principal problems in Australia is that the political parties are more captured than in any other comparable country. By that I mean, power brokers have managed to very much control the parties much more than in any other country, and they've neutralised the membership. So the membership is left to go out and raise money and appear at polling booths for the election, but the membership don't really control them. So much so that pre-selections in Australia are too often not based on merit. They don't choose people necessarily for merit. A few do sneak through, but they're essentially chosen because of their allegiance to a particular power broker. And the worst example is in New South Wales, where the New South Wales Liberal Party and the Labor Party are under control of power brokers. Quite often in New South Wales, power brokers with substantial financial interest in the decisions of government. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary level of corruption. And I think that one of the constitutional changes that should be made, I have a list of them, 5 R's, I call them.
I want that list.
And one of them is the reform of the political parties. And what we've argued is that in return for what they get, the political parties get an enormous amount of financial and legal privileges. They get so much for every vote, every first preference vote, for example. They get all sorts of allowances and other privileges. They also get legal privileges in that they get exemptions from the Electoral Act and the Privacy Act. They get the names of their parties on the ballot papers, and there's even a Senate provision which protects the seats of political parties in the event of a vacancy. And in return for all of that, they should be bound to be open, transparent, and democratic, as the American parties are. The Americans, particularly the Republican Party, are years ahead of Australia. part of the reason why the Republican Party has improved. The Republican Party was going the same way as the Liberal Party has. The voters for Republicans tend to be conservative. But when Republicans got to Washington, they then moved to the center. And similar things happening here. And Republicans, politicians quite often in America would go to Washington, not with much money. They wouldn't earn an enormous amount as a politician, but they'd come out of politics as Biden has, with enormous wealth. And Biden's come out with enormous wealth for members of his party, mainly from China. And you get that, you get a party which is moving away from the people who are voting for it, so that when you vote, you don't really have much of a choice. And what happened in America was that the autonomous members of the party formed the Tea Party movement, which had some significant effect on pre-selections, but it was one personality who had the enormous effect, that was Donald Trump. He has really changed politics in America, and of course, the politicians hate him because he comes from outside. He was also already wealthy, and he's turned everything upside down. But getting back to the new states, could I just mention this? You may not be aware of it. In New South Wales, many years ago, after the war, we had a movement, a strong movement for a separate state in the north, the New England movement. And the Country Party, as it then was, went along with it, and they threatened Askin, who was the Liberal leader, that if he wanted to form a coalition after the election, that he had to agree to a new state. So Askin agreed. He was the premier, the Liberal premier. He agreed to put a referendum up in the New England area, in the north of New South Wales, for a new state. But then of course, he played a game on them. He included Newcastle, which is a Labour area, in the areas. It always needs to have a big port. There's going to be a new state. So they added Newcastle, heavy Labour area, very much against ever belonging to New England, which would be a Country Party fiefdom. So, and it's a large population. So the effect of the referendum was lost by Askin, the Liberals, adding in Newcastle. So we should have had there should be a new state in New South Wales. It's too big. And that should be New England, as there should be a North Queensland state and a Central Queensland state. I think if we had new states with their Senate representation, which wouldn't have to be 12, it would have to be agreed. It'd be very hard not to give them the same.
Sounds a bit revolutionary, David. Sounds a bit revolutionary.
I'm not going to go along with you on that one, David. Wales.
We have got a super chat on this matter from Andrew McGuinness for $5 Australian. I find it interesting that in a country geographically similar to Australia, the US has 50 states, where we only have 8 separate areas, 6 states, and 2 territories. And it's also worth pointing out that the 50 US states, there's multiple populated cities there. For example, the state of Ohio has 2 major cities there, Cincinnati and Cleveland, same with Pennsylvania, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And states of California and Florida and Texas have multiple cities, where all of our states are completely centered on the capital city.
Well, and most of WA, for instance, is desert. So you'd have to get, kangaroos voting, or it wouldn't work.
On the other hand, it's a bit unfair for the people in the north. And I agree with what Jake was saying. The seats are far too big. There should be a maximum size for a seat, even if the populations vary. There's no need, for example, in Sydney to have so many federal seats. But there is a great need, I think, in a rural area for them not to have such an enormous seat, because the member can only get round by having a plane. Can you imagine being the member for that seat, which I think goes from the north of Western Australia down to the centre or even further south?
There's 2 massive electorates in WA. The first one is O'Connor, and the other one, I'm just looking it up now. It's held by, I was nearly going to say the wrong. Keep talking while I look it up.
Well, I live in a very large seat too, and I get what you're saying. It takes hours, 4.5 hours to drive from one side to the other. That's enormous. And in Sydney, you would have crossed 12 or 15 seats in that period of time.
Durack is the other one. So O'Connor takes in most of southeastern WA, including Kalgoorlie there, and Durack takes in all of the rest of the WA West Coast and the Kimberley Pilbara region. I've just got my WA friend there. Just he messaged me there to say it was Durack. So yes, I got there in the end. But two massive electorates.
I live in Wentworth in Sydney, and quite often I've had no choice in the elections. They've all been on the left. When Malcolm Turnbull was my member, he, Labour and the Greens were all the same. So it made no difference who I voted for.
Do you have any comments on the current member, Dave Sharma? Is he an improvement in your view?
Oh, hate it.
Well, at least he's not a Republican. I don't object to Republicans, but I object to fake Republicans. Most Australian politicians who are Republicans are fake Republicans. They have no idea about what is really Anglo-Saxon republicanism, which really depends on the philosophies of Locke and Montesquieu and building up an entity, a polity which is viable. They just want to get rid of the crown, and they want to increase the power of the politicians. In fact, a surprising number of the leading Republicans seem to prefer the Chinese model to the Australian. Keating was, when he was at La Trobe University a couple of years ago, said that China represents the best government in the world for the last 15 years.
Well, so you want to be a tyranny.
What government Keating would like.
A one-party tyranny.
How's the voting going?
So we've got up to 33% of the vote now, a third counted now. It keeps going. This is based on the ABC projections. I know it's the ABC, and you came up with a new name for the ABC, David, in one of your recent Spectator columns, aiding Beijing's communists. Mark Latham has a more crass term for the ABC, always broadcasting crap.
They should go fund themselves.
But
Jake has a name as well.
They do have Anthony Green there employed full time to do all this election stuff. So
hey Tim, I'll tell you about Rorts, okay? Paul Barry on Media Watch, I think I don't know, there was some ridiculous, like, I think he was on $260,000 a year to make one episode per week.
He does a social media update on Thursday now called Media Bites. So he has, it does twice a week now.
Well, Tim, if that's the pay grade, you should be raking it in, like a Gina Reinhardt or a Clive Palmer type figure. If that's the pay grade, if you're an ABC employee, I think you'd be on $1.3 million a year. You'd be up there with some AFL players. You'd be right at the top of the salary cap.
The Unshackled is not gifted $1 billion a year from the taxpayer for that to happen.
A small loan from the taxpayer each year.
We were talking about Sharma, and I realized that I just said openly that I don't like him. Let me quantify that with why. Ever since I saw him look dead in the eye to a lovely Asian woman who was talking about how they had escaped the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and they were being pursued in Australia by the CCP, who were monitoring them and attacking their family back home from what happened in Australia. He looked her right in the eye and denied that any of that was even happening.
Really?
And then seemed to show no problem at all with China's renewable investment having a hold over our renewable energy systems in Australia. And so I know he's smart enough to know that that was incorrect. So that was when I lost any and all support for Sharma, because I couldn't believe you could do that.
As far as I know, he's sort of one of the they're the names that is thrown around in that Wolverines parliamentary grouping, the China Hawks, as
he's trying to make a show of it now, but you should have listened when questioned how he behaved.
Well, maybe he's learnt from that.
Oh, well, one would hope. I doubt it. Do you want to throw a total spanner in the works? We're talking about medical mandates. I've been reading about the origin of them when Australia was being set up, and medical mandates were always meant to protect the survival of the nation, not to stop or protect every individual inside a nation. So they were meant for diseases that were going to cause such damage that Australia might actually fail, particularly when it was an emerging colony. And they continue to have that legislation growing through the Spanish flu and around. So when you read the 2014 report, when they sort of did a dry run of this, they accepted a 2.5% fatality rate that would not incur draconian legislation or curfews or lockdowns. So what went wrong with this particular virus that we have a fraction of a percentage death rate, with a growing evidence that herd immunity is a real thing, and it happens at 20%, not 100% or 80%. Why are we panicking so much all of a sudden and using mandates that were not designed for this purpose in the beginning? They're a misuse of medical mandates. Like, how did that happen, and why is no one questioning it?
I think it was two things. First, computer modeling. The computer modeling that they were relying on, I think, was based on Imperial College London.
Yeah, Neil Ferguson.
Professor Ferguson, who sometimes called Professor Lockdown or even Professor Pants Down.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
But he has a record of computer modeling which has been notoriously wrong. I think Washington State University also was another one, and they used, apparently here they kept it, they wouldn't release they may have released it since the time the Australian governments wouldn't release their modelling, but some were talking about predictions of 150,000 deaths. Now, why would they choose computer modelling? I think they're programmed for it because this is something which they've used in relation to global warming.
Exactly.
Computer modelling is their tool, so they're used to this. I think the other thing was, I think, the role of the American mainstream media. The American mainstream media has abandoned their responsibility, and they are now the propaganda arm of the Democrats. And they've decided that they will do anything whatsoever to get rid of Trump. And I think they have boosted the impact and the panic relating to this. And you see this in the Democrat states where they're pushing the lockdown. I think they are seeing this as the way in which they will get rid of Trump. So I think there are two reasons. Firstly, computer modeling. Secondly, the influence of the American media, which had an immediate influence here, particularly on television. And I think that's exaggerated the relevance of this disease. It's a terrible virus, terrible for those who get it. As we know, of the deaths, a lot have died with it, but not because of it.
Well, there's almost no influenza. The influenza deaths have dropped to almost zero for this winter.
Yes.
We cured influenza.
And it's worth noting the irony that David, people such as yourself and your friend Alan Jones with his excellent Sky News program, I think him being national now, his in prime time is his reach to new audiences is greater than ever. And
how good would it be to have Alan on, Tim? How good would that be?
Be on the list. But my point is that
Would you fit him in?
Oh, definitely.
We'd have to dress up though to keep up with these high standards.
Yes, definitely. But my point is that you and Alan, senior citizens, you no offense intended, but
Wow, Tim.
And none taken.
but you are the people that we are told should fear this virus, but. Well, especially Alan through his show is basically being the voice of the youth. He's telling the stories of the youth whose education and especially sport has been thrown into limbo because of this coronavirus shutdown. And it's interesting that the left progressives now, and I've noticed this in Dan Andrews' press conference, the left progressives has now have now developed this disdain of the youth for not taking this virus and lockdown seriously. Dan Andrews he's almost a few times wanted to say, "You darn kids not taking this seriously."
Well, they are taking it seriously. Like I've got people in my family who are in that 17 to 25 age bracket, and they're working pubs and bars and retail, and all they talk about is how they have worked for all their future. They've just got their jobs, and now all the industry that they work in is gone. They have no future, and they take it very seriously about what's going to happen to them. And
I meant take the coronavirus seriously.
No, but they do. They take that. They weigh it up. But they are more aware than the media give them credit for about the whole landscape of what's going on. And so when people say you don't take the virus seriously, often they are people who are not envisioning the full fallout of a virus, and that is that it's not just the virus that kills people. Poverty kills people, as does ruination of a nation, which is what's happening. And so I think it's getting mistranslated about not caring usually means they care about more than just one risk.
Well, you know, Milton Friedman said one of the biggest mistakes is to judge policy by its intention rather than its outcome. Now, whatever the intention of Daniel Andrews is, put that to one side. When people were put into hotel quarantine with these bonking bouncers, they were not forced to do a COVID swab. Now, if you're going to be put out, you know, in the Intercontinental or the Ridges or whatever, and you're being put in a, I don't know, 4-star, and you're being given 3 square meals a day, I mean, that sounds pretty good to me. And you should be forced to have that mandatory test. Now, when I came back into the country, would have been March 16, 17. I arrived at Avalon Airport in Geelong. I had some probably uni student with a pretty lispy voice and didn't sound very strong, and there was nothing. There was no force there. We were all just waved through and told to go home.
Force?
Yeah. Just some bloke. He was dressed up in a rubbish bag and he had some goggles on. And I think that if you were to put everyone in there from the beginning into those hotels, I had to get a cab all the way to my mother's place, 400 kilometres north, because there was no accommodation that would take me in Geelong. And I was just waiting for my apartment to settle. And it took so long, and it took so much money out of my pocket. But that being said, I think the people in the quarantine should have paid for it themselves, like I did, and taken the precautions. And B, if they were going to do that led the virus out in Victoria, the haphazard approach. Put them all in hotels and test them, and that shouldn't be So some civil liberties are being corroded because we've got these Kandahar Dan drones flying, were going to fly around monitoring us, you know, and we can't play, kick the footy we can't do anything. We can't have a cup of tea with mum. But what should have been done is a reasonable exercise of, curbing civil liberties would have been, say, you've come back, okay, cool. The army's going to take care of this. This happens in other places. If you look at Vietnam, for instance, they've had a very successful and they've been up there with the cyber as well, looking at the patterns. They just put people into an army-run facility for 2 weeks. They're mandatorily tested every 2 or 3 days, I think, and then after that, you're done. And then you don't have to curb the civil liberties of everyone. So there's some unnecessary curbing of civil liberties, and then there's just no exercise of common sense taken at the start. And then to say, oh, you can have this protest, or you can do this, or you can do that. Victoria is screwed, and it's a very weird thing. I don't know how, maybe if one of the more intelligent people on this panel could explain that better, but that's my feeling there.
We did not learn Orwell's lesson from Animal Farm that you can't treat people differently if you're going to enforce draconian laws. So we have celebrities flying in, avoiding mandatory lockdowns in hotels at their own expense. We've got politicians running around flying interstate and also across into other countries without the same restrictions that the citizens have.
Some animals are more equal than others.
Than other animals, yes.
Yeah.
But then we're not asking the question of, well, if it's only a few percentages or fraction of percentage above the common flu, which it is turning out to be in many countries after it settles down. It's a new virus, so it has a peak and then it settles into its normal location. It's a wild virus. So you never use lockdowns traditionally to deal with a virus that's in the wild. You do it to stop the outbreak at its source before it gets into the wild. But once you've got a virus that's in India and China and all across Europe and in South America, that's not going to go anywhere. And so
Alexandra, the horse is bolted.
That's what I mean.
And
so
Dictator Dan's trying to close the barn door.
So then the point is, are lockdowns even arguable in a court of law if you can't stop a virus long term once it's wild?
Oh, we're all for stopping the virus. Everyone's for stopping the virus.
But like, it's almost like we have to live with it now. It's
more about compliance and obedience now. That's the problem. Everyone's for stopping the virus. No one wants a virus. But now, because it's been mismanaged, it's like the kids being punished. It's about obedience. We've got to sit in the naughty corner.
Yeah, that's been Daniel Andrews' style.
Yeah, but they tied their political futures to the virus outbreak, like they tied climate change stats to their election. And once you do that, a politician will not walk themselves back from policy, because if it breaks out now, it'll mean their future election. And that's really dangerous.
Well, 1,500 suicides is more important than someone's ego, as far as I'm concerned.
I agree.
Can I just...
Am I right? Yeah. Am I right in saying that they haven't explained the reason for the lockdown, or the change in the reasoning for the lockdown? Because when it was announced originally, it was to flatten the curve.
Yes, exactly.
That is, to spread it so that the hospitals wouldn't be crowded with these 150,000 people who are going to come in. So it was flattening the curve, but now, I haven't seen any explanation, but for some time now it's been eradication. I agree with Jake. Nobody wants the virus, but using the lockdown was for the purpose of flattening the curve. Now the lockdown is said to be the tool you use to eradicate it. And I don't think that really is going to be successful. At least the number of experts say that lockdowns they'll not eradicate.
I think there's a religious element to this as well. I think there's a religious element to this, to the fact that, say, I don't know, David, I don't know what religion or you'd identify with, but I'm an Anglican, but I went to a Catholic school, and you'd practice Lent, so you'd give up something for 40 days that you'd like. So this is almost like a mass secular, undertaking of Lent. We're all having to kind of give up something and kind of experience some kind of hardship to realize what it feels to be like a messianic figure like Daniel Andrews. So we all have to kind of give up in this undertaking to kind of worship Dictator Dan. And the same goes with the Church of Climatology and their edicts on many things.
You have to look at what it does, though. The lockdowns and JobKeeper and JobSeeker, they destroy the assets of the middle class, and they inflate the assets of the kids who are entering the workforce. and it's getting rid of basically an entire tier of the Australian independent business community, who were 95-ish% of employers. It's destroying them, and it's almost giving you a socialist state, either by accident or because it suits the Labor Party to initiate such a circumstance. So you have to look at who was enforcing a lockdown, and we know that the European Union was putting financial incentive and pressure on the European states to lock down. And we had, I think it was a couple of countries complained openly, publishing what they were being basically blackmailed with to lock down. So that's not just panic spreading between leaders. There's actually institutions saying that you should lock down and putting financial incentives.
I think that there's a time and a place for government assistance in times of need. Although I would say that if you do, and when you eventually have to cut this magic money river that's pouring down from the clouds of the RBA printers, people are going to have to innovate. And when people innovate, and when you trust business, they're going to find a way to operate in a COVID-safe fashion, because people don't want to die, people want to make money, and people want to go and get on with it. But there's this whole, I'd say it's almost like a class system. You have, messianic figures like Dictator Dan, but then you've got these lay people who run small businesses, who manage many complicated affairs all the time, but they can't be trusted. You have to trust this wholly enlightened man who's got a Bachelor of Arts, who worked 6 months in an electorate office to control your life. I mean, please, it's ridiculous.
And they're also considering taking away JobKeeper and JobSeeker before they open the nation up. And that won't result in people adapting their businesses. That will result in very swift financial ruin. It has to be the other way around. They have to open first and then. Otherwise, there'll be nobody left to pay the tax back.
Well, there's many companies that actually, that I was kind of investing in around that March 23 time. They're actually receiving JobKeeper, and the margin of their profit, and these are ASX registered companies, the margin of their profit was actually the subsidies that they received in JobKeeper. That was a margin of their profit.
I have my ear in the boardrooms of some of the retail giants who have over 600 stores apiece, and JobKeeper is paying a percentage of their employment, not all of it. So they have JobKeeper, then they have the rents for all their stores, then they have almost no customers coming in. And so those businesses, they're being supported by the owners selling off their assets, getting poorer and poorer in order to try and keep these businesses afloat.
It's a mass transfer of wealth. It's a mass transfer of wealth. And ordinary people are being taxed for accessing their own money. The money in super accounts is not for the likes of Steve Bracks to go, I don't know, skiing in Switzerland and, trotting around the globe. The money in super accounts belongs to middle Australians, it belongs to workers, and they should decide how they spend their own money. But this whole aspect,
the kids in retail agree with you. They want their money so they can own a house or rent or get an asset, but they can't have access.
Well, exactly. You've effectively got a 9.5% tax on your income. So that's why Dave's generation could get set up with a house real quick and get a sound footing in a profession and really make an impact as an Australian, because they had an extra 10% income to spend. We don't have that now, because all of our assets, all of our ability, all of our talent has to be managed by unelected bureaucrats or faceless union-backed $3 trillion. They've got a $3 trillion pool of cash that they use to fund their corona union activities through super, but they don't trust us, the ordinary people. I think how you're going to resolve all of this is trusting ordinary people to get on with it and exercise common sense and to have a common sense approach to going about things. I think maybe locking Victoria for the time is good, but why the rest of the country? Why 9 cases? Would 9 cases of any other illness Even there's an outbreak of swine flu in Victoria that's really affecting the poultry industry here. That's not closing down the state, and that's a terrible thing, right? But there needs to be a proportionate response from government. There needs to be a response from government, but there needs to be a proportionate response, and people need to be trusted.
I think what Jake was saying earlier about religion is very true. I think man is programmed to believe. And Chesterton has a saying attributed to him, they can't find it anywhere in his work, was consistent with what he wrote. And that is that when man stops believing in God, it's not that he believes in nothing.
He believes in
he
everything.
Will believe in anything.
Yeah.
And we see this all the time. We see it all the time with global warming, for example. And every new stupid idea, and they're stupid ideas, but they have an underlying purpose. And they come from the United States, and they're quickly adopted here. They're believed, and if you dare disagree with them, then you're in trouble. For example, I think that there was a very silly idea about same-sex marriage. There was no need for that, because civil unions could provide all the protection that people wanted. The law protected gay people living together, and we were told that there would be vast numbers of suicides if they didn't pass same-sex marriage. But the real intent there was, I think, part and parcel of the campaign to undermine marriage as a civil institution. And so many of these are to undermine things like the ridiculous extreme gender fluidity ideas which they're using in schools. The Liberal Party, at least in New South Wales, seems to be not at all concerned.
Well, they keep, it seems that they banned, what is it, safe schools and gender, the teaching of gender fluidity. But Mark Latham, he's been watching the New South Wales Education Department like a hawk and noticing it creeping back in.
You're so right. He is a magnificent addition to the New South Wales Parliament. He certainly is making a mark, and he has followed that. He's checked on so many things that are allowed to continue in the schools in New South Wales, notwithstanding the Liberal Party being in power.
And also a fun fact about the New South Wales Education Department, the head of it is Mark Scott, former managing director of the ABC.
Such an appropriate appointment.
We've got a comment in the chat, or this is in the, oh, where'd it go? In the WilmsFront chat. No, it's, where is it? No, they must have deleted it. Sorry.
I've got two fun quotes for you from the election from the Northern Territory, from Michael Gunner, just to show you what kind of a nightmare that the election actually was. He said that he was asked about what experience he could bring as minister to the job, and he said, "The best experience I can bring to the role of chief minister is being chief minister," which wasn't really an answer to the question. And the best one was the mess that they all got onto in renewable energy, because they were talking about fracking and energy, and all three of them are a nightmare on this topic. And Gunner said, while talking about fracking in particular, "I believe in a manufacturing industry powered by the sun," which isn't exactly...
He sounds like an Aztec, doesn't he? He sounds like an Aztec.
I thought, brilliant. It's like it's a parody of an election.
It's that sort of quote. It's a bit of a rejig of the, and both I've heard both Josh Frydenberg and Anthony Albanese constantly say this. Coal will continue to be an important part of Australia's energy mix. That's such a phrase that gets in my.
But here's $100 billion to renewables, and we're going to close 3 coal-fired plants. You know, if they don't, where's the reality of the comment?
Alexander, what percentage of politicians do you think actually believe that they can change the climate?
Oh, that's a tricky
Oh,
question
dear.
because a lot of politicians I have met believe they can do a lot of things they can't actually do. There's a lot of demigods inside our political class. I think that more than 50% don't give a rat's ass either way. They say what they think is popular for that election. And if they were told to change their mind tomorrow, they would then turn around and change their mind tomorrow. So I don't think they give it a lot of real thought. Maybe 20%, like Malcolm Turnbull, the true believers, think they can. But I'd say they are in the minority.
I noticed that in the referendum. I got the very distinct feeling that most of them couldn't have cared less, but they jumped onto the bandwagon because they swallowed the line that the media was putting, that is, that a republic was inevitable. So they very quickly decided, oh, we'd better get onto it then.
If you want to control policy, change the direction of the media narrative. Then if the politicians think their seat is in danger, then they will change their minds and they will adapt their policy accordingly. That's the only.
Getting back to religion, and I think the great advantage of religion, whether people believe in Christianity or not, the Judeo-Christian values, the teachings, even though they've been twisted and perverted by governments purporting to be Christian in the past, but the teachings of Jesus are so proper and correct, whether or not you accept that he was the Son of God. The teachings are very good teachings, far superior than many. And for example, the Sermon on the Mount and the various parables and so on, those teachings are very proper and very conducive to a virtuous society. And it's better that people's minds be filled by something like that.
What about the parable of the talents there? You know, what we're essentially doing is, you know, digging all our talents away, doing nothing with them. So I think there are many lessons indeed to be learned. Yeah, would you, David, be keen to enlighten us on some of Malcolm Turnbull's character flaws? I'm more than interested to hear about those.
That's a softball question, if there ever was one.
I was invited when his book came out. It was his diary of the referendum. He published a book called Fighting for the Republic, and I remember Julie and Lisa saying it should be called Whinging for the Republic. And in it, it was obviously selective, but I noticed that in June before November, he came home and Lucy was crying, and she said, "We're not going to win." And Malcolm said, "Yes, you're probably right, because he said, the problem is nobody's interested." And I remember writing at the time, well, why didn't he tell us then that he wasn't going to win? Because it would save the country a lot of money and a lot of wasted time. But Malcolm attacked me so much in the book. I did a search when he published his later memoir. There's this last book.
Oh, this is a bitter picture. Sorry, I mean a bigger picture.
It's a bitter picture. And I went through and I found that he attacked me in Fighting for the Republic 46 times, and the only person who attacked more was John Howard.
Yes, you were quite prominently mentioned.
Sounds like, yeah.
Mm. But I think I asked you on your last appearance on WilmsFront, David, was Malcolm Turnbull your greatest asset in the Republican referendum? What are your thoughts on the current great asset to the monarchist movement, which is Peter Fitzsimons, better known as Bandana Man?
Well, if Peter asked me, I would say, Peter, please stay there, because I think he is an asset. But mind you, they say I'm an asset to them. I don't think they can really say that after the referendum results, but they say because they say all sorts of things about me. But I do think that Peter is an assistance. That they're in a terrible situation. They've now decided to give up the plebiscites, and they're trying to get an arrangement with the group that call themselves the Real Republicans. The Real Republicans are basically in Queensland, but they have other branches. They're run by a man who was the lawyer for Clem Jones. Clem Jones left them a lot of money. And the ARM realized that they've got to have an agreement with them to get up a model that everyone agrees on. The problem for the ARM is that the conservative politicians, like Bob Card, could not stomach an elected president. So what they're saying they're going to work for about 18 months and then produce a consensus model. And they've got a young man, I can't think of his name, he was an electoral consultant for the Liberal Party. He and Peter Fazamas have worked out that what they've got to do is go for a popular elected model, but they know the politician Republicans wouldn't be able to bear that. So they're proposing, I think they will propose that the president be stripped of the reserved powers. So it'll be a purely ceremonial president, and whether the Real Republicans will accept that, I don't know, but I think they'd be stupid to do so.
So David, in that instance, if they say get their miracle up and running, so we have to replace Queen Elizabeth, I guess, on the $5 note with Malcolm Turnbull and potentially Lucy on the $10 note.
Oh, and Mr. Kevin Rudd possibly too.
Eddie,
I think I'd rather move to the middle of the Pacific Ocean and live on an island.
you left out Melbourne's most well-known Republican as well, Eddie Maguire.
Oh, yes.
I think he fancied himself as Australia's first president as well.
Well, they're strapped for ideas because the Australian Republic movement on social media has been floundering around for a while now, asking their audience what they think they should do. They actually are now opening suggestions for their new government because they're not quite sure how to proceed from here on in. That and just random polls.
One of the big problems for the Republicans is firstly, of course, they're not real Republicans. They're not prepared to go away and work out a model. If you look at the six, I think, oldest continuing democracies in the world, 4 are constitutional monarchies, and I think 4 are constitutional monarchies, and Queen Elizabeth is the queen of 3 of them. But the 2 oldest republics in the world are good republics, the United States and Switzerland. Now, Switzerland is too complicated to copy. I can't see why the Republicans don't just propose that we do what the Americans have done. And of course, for that, Donald Trump is doing marvelous things for the monarchist movement in Australia.
But they don't really want a republic per se, as they say and admitted to. They want China. They want to have a one-party political system with themselves as dictator.
Yes.
That's what they actually want. But they don't want to say it out loud.
Yeah. All right, back to the NT election. So the Anthony Green has now projected officially that Labor will retain government in the Northern Territory, but it's not clear yet if they'll have a majority in Parliament. They're currently projected to have 12 seats, the CLP 4. This is with 42% of the vote counted. The 2 independents in the seats in doubt, the Labor is ahead in now 3 of them now, which if that was the case, then they'd make it to 15. The Territory Alliance, they look like only being able to get 1 seat, but definitely the CLP look like they're back in business because they're ahead in 3 other electorates, so they would have at least 7, which is, well, better than they were in the 2016 territory election, where they got completely wiped out after their tumultuous 4-year term, which had Terry Mills, then Adam Giles, and this is what you commented to me, Alexandria, off air, for such a small, well, it's not even a state, a unicameral parliament of 25 seats. It's so dysfunctional.
Well, they're either Liberals have held it for so long, but when things go wrong over there, they go really wrong for either party. It's not just, oh, it's a close call. It's quite literally you get 1 or 2 seats at the end of the day. It's a very much flipping a coin kind of state as far as their elections go. But it's pretty close to what we thought would happen, where the underlying issues of the Northern Territory have stripped some votes off Labor, given them to the Conservatives, but the coronavirus has kept people in their holding pattern. If this election was held next year, I think we would have seen a different result, but it's too soon.
I don't think, though, we'll see such an outcome in Queensland, which is, well, we've already discussed, because it is such a vast and diverse state. Well, it's concentrated in the southeast, but then there are the North Queensland regional parties now. There's 2 of them: the North Queensland Party and the Katter Party, and then obviously Pauline Hanson's One Nation does well in central and low north Queensland as well, and obviously both the LNP and ALP have their own internal issues. That'll be a much more polarized election.
Yeah, I think that the Queensland will be a bit different, as you say, having a One Nation party there with truly different politics to Labor and Liberal, because the problem with the Northern Territory is Labor and Liberal politics are nearly identical, aside from a few notes. There are other options in Queensland, and you're going to see a fair bit of rebellion showing up in those polls. And as we've discussed, it is later through the coronavirus fallout economically. I think that Labor might hold it, but it could be a minority government.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's going to be a dysfunctional minority government. And I think that's going to clear the way for a complete wipeout of the subsequent election.
I totally agree with you. It will be Conservative after that, provided that Scott Morrison doesn't screw up federally, which affects people's perception of the Liberal Party in the States.
They don't seem to have a very great leader, do they, the LNP? The present leader doesn't seem to stand out in any way.
Deb Frecklington, she projects this sort of motherly persona. But it doesn't come across as genuine. That sort of, I've seen a lot of her obviously on the news and on Sky News as well.
She's a country bumpkin, Tim. I think you need a suburban Conservative to win elections if you're a Liberal Party. You need a conservative suburban person, who has a family, has a small business. I think she's a country bumpkin. And the other guy that had their nickels last time, I remember covering that with you, the last election, he was some pro-abortionist kind of lefty. And how does that settle with country people? Badly. So I think you need to settle for a conservative suburban candidate.
If you were watching Queensland politics from outside the nation, like from America, you would think that Pauline Hanson was the opposition in Queensland because of how much press she does compared to the Liberal Party getting their face up on camera.
Yeah.
Oh, and that's what I wanted to mention about the whole, the apparatus that the Labor Party were putting in place, is that Anastasia Palaszczuk, through her probably unconstitutional unicameral system that she operates in, she has put a 100,000 cash limit that you can spend campaigning in each seat. So effectively what she's trying to do is crush any minor party that wants to challenge her Labor seats incumbencies. So she wants to crush that through, cutting off the money supply. Yet she'll let all these big unions, these big union heavies, push their weight around through the super slush fund that they've got. But she's cutting off any real competition through putting those caps. I don't know what the legality is there, but it sounds very crony and corrupt to me.
Well, the one thing they can't hide, no matter how much money or what they do electoral campaigning, is they can't outspin the real economic effects on people's lives. So if people are actually having real economic effects, they will change their vote. That's the only thing they can't hide.
I think,
but in a normal election, it would be different.
I think Donald Trump demonstrated that the amount you spend is not necessarily the influence you have in an election. But talking about Queensland, I do remember that one Queensland Premier demonstrated vividly the way in which a good federation should work. And a federation should be competitive. the great advantage of a federation is that if one state does something in a different way to the others and that proves to be superior, it is then demonstrated as the better thing to do. And what Sir Joe Bjelke-Petersen did, I think it was magnificent, was in relation to death duties. I'd been working in a law firm as an articled clerk and a young solicitor at the time, and I noticed that one thing was really terrible, and that was death duty. The impact it had on small business and farmers, where the oldest person in the family, often usually the man, died first, and the whole family would have to pay an enormous amount of death duties, sometimes up to a third of the value of the farm of the business. They were grieving. They knew they'd have to raise this money, and how do you do that without borrowing it? And you may have a mortgage already. You might have to sell the whole thing. This had a devastating impact. It was a terrible, cruel tax.
They're trying to bring it back.
Yes, the Greens wanted it. But what Joe did, it was against the advice of the Treasurer and against the advice of his staff. He just announced the abolition of death duties. And what the old Australians did, because for some strange reason, they seemed to want to leave their property to their children. They didn't seem to want to give the government a good slice. The elderly started moving to Queensland. And within 2 years, every other government abolished death duties. And the Commonwealth abolished, they had their own death duty called estate duty. They all abolished, they all got rid of this terrible tax because one premier had the strength to do that. And it demonstrated wonderfully how a federation can work so well, because you see what's happening. Well, the same in America. I suspect that my feeling is Trump will win. And I think what the media, the mainstream media in America don't understand, and the Democrats are not realizing that, is that what the Democratic governors and mayors are allowing to happen in their cities, the looting, the rioting, the murdering, and the defunding of the police, the rank and file are going to say, we don't want that. I think people are just going to be horrified by what's happening in the other states, and with good advertising by the Republicans, I think Trump will gather a lot of support.
Well, with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, he has complete mismanagement of the pandemic in that state, where he did, and along with Mayor Bill de Blasio, enact extremely harsh lockdowns. He's now, and all the wealthy New Yorkers, they've all fled to other states now, and he's basically begged them to come back now, saying, come back, I'll cook, I'll buy you a drink. And obviously our system of federation is not working at the moment because the borders are shut. We're not Australians at the moment, where we can't, most of us can't go into other states. But once the pandemic is over and the pressure comes to relax, on the ground here in Melbourne and Victoria, there's a lot of people who are thinking after the lockdown is finished of leaving as well. And so you wonder whether Daniel Andrews will adopt the Andrew Cuomo line to say, stay, I'll cook, I'll buy you a drink. Though his pitch for people to not holiday to South Australia in between, when we were a bit open, is like, oh, well, do you want to go there, holiday here? And now a lot of people say, I wish we were over in South Australia now, virus free. But the competitive federalism, if we have any at the moment, is who can be the most socialist and have their population dependent on the state.
Is on that, what we've abandoned in Australia is a very important principle which the American founders, who invented modern federation, the American founders developed the idea, the concept that each government should be principally responsible for raising its own taxes and then answer to the people at each election as to how they spent it. What's happened in Australia, and this has been really an effective coalition between the politicians and the judges of the High Court. For about 100 years now, the judges have reinterpreted the Constitution not according to its original intention. They've effectively granted the Commonwealth powers which the people refused to give them in a number of referendums, so that the Commonwealth has accrued powers which were never intended for the Commonwealth. And we are the most fiscally centralist federation in the world, with 80%, about 80% of the taxes. It doesn't happen in any other federation. It would astound them if they did. 80% of the taxes go to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth gives back about half of that to the states, but on condition. So it effectively runs the states and moves into areas which are completely state matters, have nothing to do with the federation, moves into them and tries to control them, as it does, for example, in relation to school education. So we have this distorted federation, which is very costly. I think in one report by Toomey and Withers to the premiers about 10 or 15 years ago worked out that the cost of this double dealing and having the Commonwealth trying to move in on areas of state competence instead of doing what it should be doing, for example, attending to defence, that's cost us something like about 10% of the GNP, not just once, but every year. It's a GDP run. It's an extraordinary cost that we put up with by this mismanagement. And it's something that people rejected, because I looked at, during the referendum, I was asked by some people, what happens if we win the first referendum and they come back with another? And I looked at the repeat referendums, and I found that there were times when the Commonwealth had tried up to 5 times to get a power from the people. The people said yes once. I'm sorry, the people said no once. They kept on saying no. But then when I looked at the powers that the Commonwealth had tried to get in the past, I came to the conclusion that most of them would not be necessary to ask the people now, because the High Court has effectively given the Commonwealth control over those powers. So we have this bizarre federation, which looks as though the states have some considerable power, but they have very little, particularly financial power. They're throwing their weight around, but only because Morrison lets them.
I think the people are in general opposition to many of the powers and decisions that are being made without their consent.
Yes.
And the reason that neither the states nor the federal government will ask anybody is because they don't want it put in print what the people actually think of the decisions they are decreeing in many different areas, including, for instance, their reliance on renewable energy. If they actually asked if people wanted cheap, reliable baseload or more Chinese solar panels, I think they'd be shocked to discover what the real answer actually was.
I'm sure. The same with when it came to work choices, for example, which I think was a mistake. It was trying to do it as a big bang. When that came to the High Court, it was pointed out to the High Court that the people had refused to hand over industrial relations, internal industrial relations, to the Commonwealth in referendums. But the High Court said, well, we don't know that they meant that in relation to this bill. They completely dismissed the fact that the people had said no when they validated work choices, which was a great pity, because I think that was why Howard was defeated. It was a silly idea, not silly because of the content of the idea, but trying to do it as a big bang. They should have just done it gradually. That's an interesting historical exercise.
It's just past 10 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. I did intend for this stream to go for around about 2 hours when we'd hopefully get a result. It looks like we have, with Labor looking like they'll scrape over the line in the Northern Territory with a reduced majority. So I don't think it's quite the mandate Michael Gunner was hoping for. But as you said, Alexandra, he's the chief minister for another 4 years, which is all that he ever wanted. I'll just run through. It's quite difficult to go through the super chats when there's a panel like this. I'll just go through them quickly. One here is regarding religion. I think this means left-wing religion. It's called secular Sharia, or I call it socialism. That's for $5. A question for David. This is a $7.99 super chat. I love your voice. Could you do voiceovers for documentaries?
Well, if I'm approached, and it's a documentary I don't object to. If it's a documentary from Get Up, I would object.
Unless it was on the fall of Get Up.
Oh, yes, I do that.
You should do one on Malcolm Turnbull.
Little Malcolm.
All right. Does anyone else have any closing remarks?
Only to thank you and my colleagues, Alexandra and Jake. I think it was a wonderful discussion. We moved a bit away from the Northern Territory election, but it was relevant to it, and I enjoyed it. And I think what you're doing, Tim, is wonderful because you're offering an alternative.
Oh, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I did intend this stream to be a general Australian political discussion catch-up, because there is, as I said in my introduction, this is the first post-coronavirus election, and so it's certainly worth looking at not just this election but the Queensland election to come, how the borders are being politicised, and given your legal expertise, David, whether these state border closures are constitutional under Section 92. We've got Clive Palmer. He's as determined as ever with this to challenge WA's hard border closure. The WA state government has gone as far to deny him natural justice over that arbitration mining approval decision, and now he's slapping Mark McGowan with defamation lawsuits, which is Clive's bread and butter. So Clive, over the years, he's said some quite weird things, but on this one, he's on the border issue. He's definitely right. It's strange that he's our hope this time.
And on the arbitration, I think it's outrageous, absolutely outrageous, that anybody should be stripped of their legal rights. This is, as I mentioned in Spectator, a bill of attainder, which were acts of the British Parliament, which named the person, found them guilty of an offence without a trial, and sometimes had them executed and all their property seized. But thank you very much for the opportunity tonight.
Yes, I'd like to thank you too, Tim, and apologies if you heard me typing away. I was making notes on you, David, through some of your great points I'm learning. So, and thank you also, Jacob. It was lovely to chat to you.
All right. I guess it's my turn for the customary remarks of thanks to everyone. Yeah, it's been good. It's a good balance you've got here, Tim, and we're up against the big juggernauts. We're up against the Australian Bolshevik Collective. We're up against, I guess they're on our side, but, you know, Rupert Murdoch's Sky News.
Oi!
And they've got big money and big dollars, but we've got big hearts and hopefully big minds. And I hope that this broadcast has given some insight to the viewers.
Alexandria, she still wants to get a call back to go back on Sky later. That's why she objected to what you said.
I would love Rupert. I'd love to get knighthoods back and get Rupert Murdoch a knighthood. Personally, I know there's a few technicalities with him not being an Australian citizen anymore, but I love Rupert Murdoch, and I think he's was actually a great man.
Broken today that because he sold Sky in the UK, that's owned by Comcast NBC now, but he's looking to get back into the television news business in the UK, teaming up with Nigel Farage. It's got the working name GB
really?
News. They should just go out and call it Fox News UK. Why not?
Look, Farage is my favorite. I'll get on board with that.
I remember reading that I think it was Lady Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher, as she then was, tried to get him to accept a peerage. He would have been Lord Murdoch.
Oh, wonderful.
To America.
Wonderful.
He preferred to go to America.
Oh, the mad witches would have a field day with that.
But in all seriousness, the left loves to demonise Rupert Murdoch as some kind of demonic figure. But the Australian's a great newspaper. I'm a subscriber to the Australian, and without the broadsheet of the Australian, without Rupert Murdoch in Australia, we would have no class and no quality in our media system. I'm not meaning to sound sycophantic there, but Rupert Murdoch is a visionary. The work with Roger Ailes and Fox News, a lot of this has actually given us the leverage that we need to stand proud and be conservatives.
And shout out to Sky After Dark, because if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't even be commentating on politics. This was just a hobby, talking rubbish on Twitter about basically Sky News of a Sunday, and here I am.
And David, you also regularly appear on Sky News, and I also heard that maybe you might be getting a show or podcast on The Good Source.
Yes, that's right.
So we'll watch this space to await an announcement on that.
Good.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience on both the Unshackled and WilmsFront channel. Very good participation tonight in the live chat as well, and thank you to all of you as well, Alexandra, David, and Jacob. It's been fantastic, and of course this is an Unshackled tradition. Every time there's an election, even if it's a by-election, we do a live stream. So the ACT election is coming up, and then obviously the Queensland state election, and of course the big one, the US presidential election. I'll be doing one for that. The US one, that'll be probably the most marathon on one, where it'll go for a number of hours, but that's the big one. So you said, David, you're optimistic Trump will get re-elected. That's what we're all hoping as well. He can do it. He did it before.
If I may just add on that, I make one exception, and that is that if the amount of fraud in the United States rises to the level which the Hawke government gave to Australia.
Yes, because the mail-in ballot experiment, it should be called, that could have a significant impact on whether there's a winner declared on the night, or whether all the votes find it back to the voting centres.
You can riot in the streets, but you're not allowed to go to the ballot box. That seems to be how America works.
The advantage that America has is that electoral laws are essentially state laws. Whereas in Australia, federal elections have always been governed by federal law. So if you were intent on pulling a fast one, you could do it very easily from Canberra. And that's what they've done. We have compulsory voting. And when the Hawke government, Graham Richardson, I think, designed it, when the Hawke government decided to make voting easier, nobody complained about it being difficult. They decided to make it easier. Until they did that, we had to vote in our own subdivision, so people knew who you were, and they made it much easier by letting you vote anywhere you wanted to. So that encouraged multiple voting, and they made it easier to register.
Because at least with the Australian Electoral Commission, they still have those phone books of marking you off. You don't have to show ID or anything. You can just show up to any polling booth and say, I'm this person, and they just ask you to confirm your details. Have you voted anywhere else? And they put a line through it, and there have been numerous people who've been accused of voting twice or not voting because they put the line through the wrong name in the phone book.
If you spent any time around the young Labor kids during election time, vote early, vote often was all you heard from them. It was like a mantra.
Yes.
And of course, early voting, pre-polling, that's becoming more and more of a trend.
I think it's appalling.
Yeah. And which is why we only have still in the Northern Territory election 44% of the vote counted. The polls have been closed for nearly 4 hours now, and I don't see why they can't count the early votes immediately. This is what, and I also forgot to mention that we're going to be doing a stream for the New Zealand general election, which was going to be on September 19th, has now been moved to October 17th because of the Auckland lockdown. But their early voting, it's actually counted during the election day. So when their polls close at 7 p.m, they've already got pretty much a clear indication of the result. And another fun fact about New Zealand election, campaigning around polling booths is banned, so they have no how to vote cards at all.
Good heavens.
Well, the only people who object to voter reform to make it harder to vote multiple times are Greens and Labor. I put a few posts up online about that, and all I got was far left shrills going, "You can't reform voting," and it was like, yeah, you can. They're the ones who object to it.
Yeah.
It tells you a lot about the system.
Yeah, and I should add in, I know that this is a very slow wrap up, but you're in probably well, it's not really a trench Twitter, it's more of a gutter or sewer, but you do an amazing job there going into the lion's den and copying it. And I was going to mention it to you before, but I'll squeeze it in now. But it's definitely clear, especially through the I Stand With Dan Twitter crew, they're viciously attacking those female journalists who are asking legitimate questions of Dan Andrews, Rachel Blacksondale, Alex White, Sophie Ellsworth, and Gabriella Power. It's interesting that, and you would know about this, that the left progressive who claim to be feminist, they seem to reserve their most vicious vitriol for female journalists such as those I mentioned, and female commentators such as yourself.
Well, look, I get told to go back in the kitchen quite often by the left, at which point I remind them that the kitchen is where all the knives are. So, but, you know, I say the same thing I tell everybody else when I get asked about Twitter. Twitter is an incredible tool for reading a nation, as long as you understand how to read it. It is obviously not an exact split of the entire population, but it does give you a view into how the different factions of a population are thinking. And a lot of people throughout history, leaders and political minds, would have killed to have a tool like this. And I find it extraordinary how our politicians, their only inclination is to censor it, when really they should listen to it and find out what the people really think.
All right, we'll call it now. Thank you so much, everyone, panelists and audience. Good night, everybody. I'll be back for a Monday night WilmsFront episode, 7 p.m, just on WilmsFront YouTube and D-Live, with Rafael Fernandez returning to the show. So I'll see you then. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting the Unshackled.net to view all our shows, and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.